Pixar's Up was released in 2009 and since then has become a cult classic in the animation genre. We are joined today by Popcorn Psychology. It's a podcast that combines mental health and movies, hosted by three licensed therapists, Brittany Brownfield, Hannah Espinoza, and Ben Stover. Let's get into our episode breaking down Up. Welcome to today's crossover episode of Raiders of the Lost Podcast and Popcorn Psychology, breaking down Pixar's Up. Thanks so much for doing this crossover with us, Popcorn Psychology. We're so excited that you've joined us, and we can't wait to talk about Up. How are you all doing?
We're doing great. Hi, this voice is Brittany.
I'm Ben.
Hi, my name is Hannah.
Welcome to our show, everyone, and we love Pixar. Up is one of their greatest achievements, I think, narratively and with animation when it was getting really advanced. But they also were tackling very intense themes, very mature themes for children to take on when they watched the film. I thought they did a beautiful job. And in terms of like the writing and storytelling, the first act of Up could be the best thing Pixar has ever done in terms of narrative fiction. I think it's really wonderful. And then tackling mental health themes so beautifully and with so much nuance. I think this is a special movie, and every child should watch this as they're growing up. And I would love for our audience to find out where they can find your show, Popcorn Psychology, give a little background on what it's about, and we can do the same thing for your listeners that are tuned in for our show as well.
Sure. So Popcorn Psychology, we are on, this is our 6th season, I believe. We are all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as mental health therapists. And every episode of our podcast, we pick a movie like Up, and we talk about the themes of mental health we see in that movie. You can find us anywhere on social media on Popcorn Psychology, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. On Twitter, you can find us at popcorn_psych. And we're on pretty much every big podcast app. Wherever you find podcasts, you can find us. And where can our listeners find you all?
Likewise, we're very easy to find. Raiders of the Lost podcast on every platform. We do about 4 to 6 episodes every week about new and old releases of cinema and film, TV as well. We talk a lot about movie news as well. So we're super easy to find. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. Just search Raiders of the Lost Podcast. So easy to find. Or our website, raidersofTheLostPodcast.com. And we're 2.5 years into our podcasting journey. It's been so fun to connect with so many movie lovers and cinephiles around the world, and finally making this connection. Very excited to be here with you all. So thanks again for joining us on this crossover episode of Raiders of the Lost Podcast and Popcorn Psychology. Now let's get into Up, which came out in 2009. IMDb, this is at an 8.3 with 1.1 million ratings. That's absurd. And that puts it at number 111 on the all-time IMDb user rating list. It's very loved. Clearly, Rotten Tomatoes critic score is at 98%. I don't know who would give this a rotten review. I don't know. 90% audience score. It won 2 Academy Awards off 5 nominations. It won Best Music for Michael Giacchino and Best Animated Feature for Pete Docter, who was one of the co-directors of the film. On a budget of $175 million, Up was a massive success at the box office, making a total global box office of $735 million. Goodness gracious. And it follows 78-year-old Carl Fredricksen, who, after the passing of his wife Ellie, reluctantly goes on a journey to the location of their mutual lifelong dream adventure, Paradise Falls, in a floating house held up by balloons, directed by Pete Docter, Bob Peterson, written by Pete Docter, Rob Peterson, and Tom McCarthy. And Up was really important, I think, for Pixar in its future because it was relying, obviously, on Toy Story, on Cars, something like The Incredibles, Bug's Life, so kind of the fantastical. And so Ratatouille as well, you know, a rat that can cook, a little fantastical. And so Up was a really, it's a really important step in Pixar's future in terms of storytelling to relate to all audiences and to relate to human beings and telling truly human stories. And that's why I think it's so special in Pixar's filmography, because after this, they could basically make a film about anything. It didn't have to be talking animals, didn't have to be talking inanimate objects. It could be just about human beings. So I think that was really important for them. Although there are talking animals in this movie
yes.
via technology. What do the three of you think about Up as a film?
Well, I remember I did write in my notes that the intro is perfect storytelling, like you said earlier, like such a perfect way to succinctly tell a lifetime with almost no dialogue, really. The montage is like, I think, dialogue less pretty much. And so, and I also remember watching it. This is only the second time I'd watched it actually. And when I watched it the first time, that intro was such like a gut punch in terms of a quote unquote kids movie being so grown up in certain ways, like talking about infertility and cancer and death. And for all that to be in like the first 15 minutes of a child's movie. I remember when I watched it, I think I was with my mom and my brother, and we all looked at my brother, I think, because he's the one who wanted to watch it. We were like, what the hell is this, dude? Like, we're supposed to watch like a fun movie and we're all weeping on the couch right now.
With the
What
Cool
hell?
Whip. Yeah, I think this movie is fantastic. I think the storytelling is just absolute perfection, and it did open them up to be able to tell any story they want, which they went on and did with Soul and some of the other things that they've done where they address some pretty deep topics. And I think this movie did pave the way for them to do it. It is profoundly human storytelling. I think it's targeted at an elder audience than they usually do, as I watched it last night with my 5-year-old, and I think a lot of it was over her head, but even still enough, she asked some of the right questions because of this movie and was able to grasp the concepts of someone being sad because someone is gone and that they're life changing when they're old, and also meeting your heroes might not be as advertised. And I think that's an important lesson to learn at any point in time, but also watching just the colors and the animation grab her attention, even if she wasn't the most enthused with this, is maybe with Frozen or something else that she might have been the right demographic for, but she still gravitated to this and enjoyed watching it. And I did too.
I love this movie. I've watched it probably 100 times, I would guess. I feel like every time I watch it, I listen to the music a bunch afterwards because I really love the music that goes along with the film. I think it's a really beautiful story that's told in such a different way, and such an interesting connection to have between an older generation and a younger generation that we don't normally see in stuff like this. And so, yeah, so I really enjoy this film. I think there's so many different important thoughts and feelings that are brought up, and the way that and even if they're not always directly talked about, you still get to really experience them with this in this film. And so I think that that's really fun. But I love this movie. I laugh and smile and cry in all the same spots I did the first time that I watched it. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, and the animation in general, just to go on the production for a little bit, is just spectacular. Still holds up, I think, as one of the best that Pixar's ever done. I was watching it for the first time in years. I'm just the things like the reflections in the window, the hair of young Ellie poofing out and falling back down. It still holds up compared to, like, I would say their last 3 features that Pixar's come out with. And there's so many cool facts, like all the characters are based upon circles and rectangles, except for the villains who are triangles. Not only are Carl and Ellie based on squares and circles, but objects around them are also based on shapes like their chairs and picture frames. When they both appear in a photograph, the frame is both circle and square. And I just think that when Pete Docter, he's one of Pixar's best filmmakers and directors. He's done Monsters, Inc., he's done Up, Inside Out, Soul. He really connects you animation-wise as well as the story to the audience to the story so well. And I think he's just operating on so many different types of storytelling to intrigue people subconsciously, whether they see it or not, like seeing that everyone's based on a shape, whether they're a hero, a protagonist, or a villain. I think that, animation is just the ultimate form of artistic imagination when it comes to storytelling. And I think Pete Docter knows how to connect to an audience. Yeah, and in terms of the storytelling, Pixar has always done a wonderful job of relating themes beautifully and weaving them into their narratives. And oftentimes, like I said, in the early days of Pixar, there were pretty simple themes, more themes that were more relatable for children. Movies like Pixar's Toy Story and The Incredibles, they definitely touch those themes really well. But in terms of the themes of this film, tackling mental health, tackling grief and depression, tackling intense loneliness, losing a loved one. It was really complex and very mature for the young demographic that they usually hit with their audience. And so it was a challenge, I think. But Pete Docter, being such an experienced pro, and also Finding Nemo is another great one. Excellent themes about family, but this is darker themes. You know, you see life and you see the formation of life and the beautiful aspects to a love and a relationship and creating a partnership with another human being, but then losing that human being, and then this person is left with nothing. That's a very complex thing for children to take in when they watch a movie with talking dogs. And yet Pete Docter and the Pixar crew and team did a wonderful job tackling these complex themes in a way for kids to be able to digest it, understand it, and even learn from it in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just in the beginning montage, like we discussed earlier, that so many of these kind of movies, like Disney Pixar-esque movies, like animated movies, if you think back on like Disney princess movies, is this once you find true love or whatever, that everything will work out. So I think what is really interesting and probably pretty hard for like a little kid to wrap their head around, so it might be more of an older kid or older person, is in this movie, we see two people who pretty much meet their soulmates, like their perfect person, when they're teeny tiny. And that does not mean that they get everything that they wanted, that it's just happily ever after. It is kind of it is really heavy to watch these two people not get the two biggest things they really wanted for themselves, which is to have a child or have many children and to go on this big adventure to this place they've always wanted to go. And it does make me think what was going on in the animators or the storytellers, the writers, the directors' mind to keep showing that they would get this money saved up and then something would happen, such a real life thing, get in a car accident, break your leg, whatever, your roof needs repaired, and then you have to spend the money you've saved up. I think that idea that you can be a quote unquote good person, you can be with the love of your life, and life is still going to happen to you. And you don't always get the things on paper that you thought you always wanted. And that's such an interesting message to deliver up top, right up top for a kid's movie.
I definitely agree. And well, I think that connects, Brittany, to one of the main themes of the film that I love is adventure and a journey. And, you know, Ellie and Carl, their life dreams mutual, this adventure to go to Paradise Falls. But I think also at the same time, what the film is showing is a partnership or someone to spend your life with or a relationship is just as much of an adventure as going to the most fantastical place in the world where your hero Charles Muntz went to discover this supposed giant creature that he supposedly made up, and to be an adventurer and to explore. I think that a relationship can be as much of an adventure as the most fantastical thing you can imagine. I think that's important to connect, that you don't have to do the most grand thing in the world to live a fulfilled life, as long as you find someone who makes you happy and you make them happy. That's a great point, because when Carl does make it to Paradise Falls and he has the house there, he's not even close to satisfied. And then he realized he was chasing a futile dream that wasn't going to fulfill him. He already did find fulfillment and he lost that, but now it's time to search for it again in other human beings.
Which was beautifully indicated in the little note that Ellie wrote him in her book that said, "Thanks for the adventure. Now go find another one."
I just got goosebumps.
Well, a lot of our recent episodes, we've talked about meaning making and just how to find meaning in your life. Like we opened this season with Everything Everywhere All at Once. And so that was a big theme when we talked about that movie. And I think what you guys are touching upon is that idea of what brings meaning to our life. And what we saw Ellie and Carl do is when they realized they couldn't have children, is they switched that meaning to this idea of Paradise Falls. Like we will find something else to get us through this or to like give us meaning within our life. And then that didn't happen because of all the other stuff going on in life. And Ellie trying to switch that meaning for Carl of like what an adventure means as she's moving on. And then we see Carl. I mean, that's kind of the course of this movie, is Carl finding his meaning again. Like, what is his sense of purpose now that his biggest sense of purpose, his wife, is gone? And that's really hard to do when, as we've talked about in our recent episodes, sometimes that's all the work we do with clients is, how do you find purpose for yourself? And how do you find something that feels meaningful when there are so many circumstances in your life that are either out of your control or that feel like they're out of your control? And when those things that are out of your control feel so closely tied to the things that you want, like having children, going on what we would in the dictionary kind of put as an adventure, and then what? And then what do we do with that? Which is the course of like Carl's journey on the movie.
In Carl's journey, it really has two paths, and they're reflected and mirrored by two characters, to keep going off that. So Carl and Charles are a reflection of each other, and then also Carl and Russell are reflections of each other, and both Russell and Charles represent paths that Carl can take after he's lost Ellie. Russell is this young kid who's very excited and wants to be an explorer. He's just trying to get that one help the elderly patch for his Boy Scouts troop to become the ultimate Cub Scout or whatever he has to be. And it's exactly like what Carl was like when he was a little kid as well. Before he met Ellie, he was so excited. He was very nervous and shy, but he was excited about adventure, and he has those goggles. He's obsessed with Charles Muntz. So Russell's a path in his life that he can take because they mirror each other. If he can find that adventure in his life again and excitement, then Charles, on the other hand, even Carl and Charles, their names are very similar. Charles is a representation of a path of never letting go of his obsession or letting go of his grief. So Charles can't let go of his obsession of finding this animal and getting his reputation back on the secluded place. And Carl won't let go of his grief of Ellie. So they're both kind of reflections of paths that he can take going forward in his life.
They both also represent self-isolation, where Charles isolates himself on the island for decades, just like how Carl's isolating himself in his home without wanting to establish any new relationships with other people. So they both have representations of self-isolation, which is a dark trait that a lot of people can suffer from, and it's really well explored in this film.
Yeah, you might say that Charles is his shadow, if we're looking at it in Jungian terms. It's a shadow self, and seeing that and getting a chance to confront it and defeat it is a classical theme that you would deal with in psychoanalytic therapy or Jungian therapy, where helping people find and recognize the darkness in themselves and decide what they can't become. And Charles Muntz represents exactly that. He is so lost himself that he is willing to forego everything that it means to be a national hero just to prove that he was right. And that darkness has festered in him for must be 50 years. That's a long time to be isolated chasing a giant bird with talking dogs.
well with dogs, that it feels like he made technology so that he wouldn't be as lonely in some way. Because
and also they use I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, they use dogs separately as well, Carl and Charles. Carl eventually learns to love Doug the dog, perfectly named.
Squirrel.
Whereas Charles is really just using dogs as a tool for his obsession in his isolation as well. So you can look at the way they accept dogs and treat dogs later on for Carl, for how they're able to move on past their grief or their obsession.
I also think that this film does an incredible job of showing a more nuanced and human take on elderly people for children. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember you look at old people, you can't imagine them being children. You can't imagine them like having their lives. To you, like, they're just old people, and they can be sometimes off-putting when you're little and maybe a little scary. There's like an archetype, and this film shows that, all these older people, they were just like you once, and they had a childhood. They used to have fun. They used to go on adventures. They used to do the same things with their friends that you do, whether it be playing and whatever. So I think the entire intro of Carl and Ellie's entire life together, but meeting as children and showing that the lead character of the film, we walked into this movie understanding it was an old man named Carl was going to be the lead, but when you watch the first 7 minutes of this film, he's a child. So I think it's important that I'd never seen that in a kids movie, where you can really the children can relate and understand that this old man was just like me once, which I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because typically in movies where they're trying to teach kids to be nice to older people, it's usually like Home Alone style, where first they're like a spooky villain, and then they're like, no, they're like human beings like us, but they don't really connect them to, like you're saying, like being you, like they were like you one day. It's not just like they're an older person that isn't as scary as you thought, like a boogeyman. They're actually kids too, which I do think is, I did write in my notes that this movie is trying to, it seems like it's trying to highlight the humanity in older people, and that they need love and affection and care and consideration just like everybody else, and that we're all gonna get old one day, God willing. And so how do we want to be treated as an old person ourselves? So kind of breeding hopefully some empathy for everybody on every stage of life that they're in.
Which is important. And it's also important that it provides parents an opportunity to start implanting truth into children early. As I know my child was asking me, she's like, oh, what happened to the girl? Did she get sick? Did she die? And then like I told her, yeah, kiddo, nobody lives forever. Like, people don't live forever. And I think that's such an important truth that parents don't always want to tell kids and don't always want to talk about with kids, that just life is precious due to its impermanence, and communicating that to children early and often, that they can understand that taking the picture and being with somebody and doing special things is important, because you never know how much time you get. And the more we can start teaching that earlier, the easier it is for kids to understand and not be shocked, and for parents to have to tell more stories about what happens when somebody's not around anymore. Because it will happen.
Are there any documented statistics or anything of parents, if they wait too long to teach their kids about grief and death and life, or does it have any kind of effect on kids? Is there any kind of study like that you would know of?
Not off the top of my head.
Not top of my head, other than what I always told parents as like the resident kid therapist, is that kids are smarter than you think, in that they're savvier than you think, and they're curious. And if you choose not to tell them something, they're going to figure it out either from their peers or a book or now the internet or a movie. And what I just like to remind parents is, you're going to lose your window to have some way to not control the narrative, but to hold the narrative in such a way that your kid will know what to do with that information. Because kids are especially when they're little, even like Russell's age, maybe a little younger than that, they're forming boxes in their brain with all the information that's coming in all the time. And you get to decide, well, you get to help the kid decide like how to put those boxes in their brain. And so either something's going to be scary or misinterpreted, or I don't know, they're just going to put their kid lens on it. And so I don't have any statistics to back up what I'm saying, other than what I know anecdotally from doing this work, and that kids usually know more than you think about what's going on, especially if you hold on to things past a certain age. Like I would say probably past, well, I was about to say something, I take it back, because I've worked with kids as little as kindergartners, where I could tell that they knew something was up, whatever that up is, if it's death or even incarceration or something like that going on within their family, and no one's really telling them because they don't want to break the bubble of it. But the kid is usually already somewhat aware that something odd's going on, and now they have to use their little kid brain to try to conceptualize what it is. So yeah, like movies like this that introduce topics, I think are great for parents to launch off of, and then kind of like, sounds like you might have had, Ben, like have a more deeper conversation, like not even necessarily like Carl with Ellie, but also I think this movie does a good job with like Russell of bringing up another really heavy topic, which is a parent that's not that around, and that they don't really skirt around it. Like they bring it up several times in which Russell, even though he's a happy-go-lucky looking kid, has a dad that neglects him And the movie does a good job of making that obvious without getting too Hallmark, this is a very special episode energy about it. And also without like really beleaguering it too. It stays right in that sweet spot pocket of how a kid would really conceptualize and maybe even talk to their friend about their parent not really being around as much as they should.
Which really illustrates the point of the question you guys are asking. Look at the difference between how Carl or not Carl, but the kid whose name just left my head, but Russell, thank you. How Russell and even Forrest Gump answer when people ask, "Where's your dad?"
What does Forrest Gump say?
He's on vacation.
Oh.
Because that's what Mrs. Gump says.
Oh, Mrs. Gump.
Yes. But when you see these kids, they don't have the opportunity to grieve. If we don't tell them the truth, they don't have the opportunity to both pre-grieve and grieve and close out a relationship that's hurting them. Now, obviously, that's difficult with parents, but kids that are told truths that dad can't come, dad isn't going to come, dad isn't making space for you right now, and have the opportunity to go, oh, okay, well, I guess I don't need to think about dad anymore. We're taking away the opportunity to grieve and close out a chapter or a connection that they need to close out. And lessons from movies like this of getting to see kind of the damage that can do when we tell kids half truths, but they still figure out, like Brittany's saying, that like, yeah, dad doesn't really have time for me. It's heartbreaking to them. And we need to take lessons from even what Sesame Street did in the late 70s or 80s when Mr. Hooper died. Watching episodes like that where they just address it and they tell the cold, hard truth of it, where the cast has to tell Big Bird that Mr. Hooper is not coming back ever. And listen to Big Bird's childlike questions of, well, will he come back tomorrow? And it's heartbreaking, but it also allows them to adjust and deal with the truth rather than waiting for the time that they invented in their brain that the details that make sense to them make sense to the rest of the world, and it doesn't come.
In terms of Russell, is his happy-go-lucky nature, clearly he's being affected by his father, as he reveals it multiple times in the film, and it's very sad at times. In a way, would you say he could be projecting an outward happiness that he isn't really feeling, but around others he wants to just be perceived as being very happy, always having fun, while trying to hide his real inner turmoil?
I don't think kids that age think that deep into it. Usually kids not until the age of 12 have their brain developed enough that may be possible. I think Russell is probably just trying to do the best that he can to be happy and be in the moment. There may be some of that, but it won't be as intellectually available to him at this stage in his development.
I will say where I'm nervous for Russell, my little heart is nervous for Russell, is I think he's already developing quite a people-pleasing like coping mechanism. Like I wrote in my notes, like he's very brave and doesn't worry enough about his own health and safety over helping others. And it made me so happy because I hadn't watched this movie in like 15 years, so I didn't remember what happened after that. But then right after that, Carl tells him that I don't need your help and I'd rather you be safe than give me help. And I was like, that's exactly what I was talking about. Because I do think with Russell, he probably, like you're saying, Ben, that's probably a lot of that is probably his personality. And I would, if I was his therapist, I would want to make sure that to keep an eye on that behavior as I continue to work with him as he gets older, because I work with a lot of older people too, that there's so much of that good student, good kid, people pleasing energy to overcompensate for places where they feel like they're lacking or they must be lacking. Because if dad's not showing up, then maybe I just need to try harder, or they connect their achievements with their value. So where we see Russell making that one-to-one connection already, that if I just can get this badge, then my dad will show up. And that's enough for my dad to show up and be there for me. And I see that, like I said, we're all still little kids inside of us, right? Even as adults. And so I work with adults sometimes where that little kid still shows up as, you know, I have to go above and beyond, or I like perfectionism, or I can't, you know, say no to anybody, or I have to always be happy or have a smile on my face because I don't want to like rock the boat or upset anyone, you know. And then I think what happens with that is then you end up denying your needs in yourself. I think what doesn't make me, where I'm on with you, Ben, in that he's still a little too young for that, is he still does things that's very age appropriate and annoying kid behavior, like laying down and letting himself be dragged because he's not feeling it. So he's not a kid where he's not already doing that thing where like they're totally denying themselves and totally like, I don't need anything. Like, I think in an older kid with this stuff going on, there might be a lot more of denial of things and trying to like smile really big the whole time and not act like anything's bothering them. But Russell still does enough obnoxious, self-driven behaviors that I think is very age appropriate, that says that he's not quite hit in that like perfectionistic thing yet. Because I don't, like Ben was saying, I don't think he's quite old enough yet.
No,
to
I
do all
perceive
that.
him as like
Yeah.
10.
Yeah.
And so he's desperate, and he's always been seeking the approval and acceptance of his father. And so in a way, he's seeking that in other people by being a people pleaser.
And the achievement. He has that
And the
one badge. He'll
achievements,
do
yeah.
anything to get that, helping the elderly badge.
I mean, he like puts himself on a floating house. Like so
Exactly.
dangerous for a badge, because in his mind it's not a badge. It's like, this is how I'm going to see my dad again. And
Also, to be fair to
yeah.
Russell, it wasn't floating when he got on it.
True,
Yeah,
but he
that's
could
true,
have
yeah.
jumped off. I mean, I'm sure he
could've
might have
jumped
got
off.
scared
He,
and like
he could
back
have
into
jumped
the
off, I
house.
think.
He
But
needed
makes
that
a lot of
badge.
choices that are wild, but he's also like a little adventurer, I assume. He's a little explorer.
Well, speaking of the floating house, so fun fact. So if Carl's house was approximately 1,600 square feet, and the average house weighs between 60 to 100 pounds per square foot, it weighs about 120,000 pounds. If the average helium balloon can carry 0.009 pounds or 4.6 grams, it would take 12,658,000 balloons to lift this house off the ground, but only 20,622 balloons appear on the house when it first lifts off, only enough to lift about 185 pounds. So Pixar, you gotta step your game up. But still
20
looked
million.
still looked incredible. But the motif of balloons are so important throughout this film. It starts early on with Ellie sending that little balloon message to Carl when he's in his bed after the injury, which is so funny. He's like, I'm gonna go on an adventure, and falls right down through the attic, and he breaks his arm or something like that. And then obviously Carl does that in their elderly age when she's in the hospital, as well as being a balloon salesman, and then eventually lifting up the house out of frustration when he's going to get evicted out of his house with all the balloons, and even just the little shots of him. They worked at, what was it, a zoo or an amusement park where she works with the animals, and he has the balloon carts, and he's always preventing it from falling. But this motif of balloons is obviously the main image of this movie, the posters and everything. And for me, I'm always trying to figure out what the balloons represent to Carl, to anyone. And I'm pretty much usually stumbling upon, they represent youth, they represent love, and they represent dreams, whether Carl realizes it or not. And it represents Ellie in a lot of ways.
For me, it's rising from hardship and rising from turmoil into a new level of your life. So the rising, the ascension, getting out of that funk if someone's in the funk.
What do y'all think the balloons mean?
Fragility. The fragility of that happiness and the youth, that Carl makes points throughout the film to constantly put his elbow back down to keep things from floating away. But much like a balloon and the happiness that they bring, life is precious and fragile, and it only lasts for so long. And we all have to eventually say goodbye to our balloons, just like Carl has to say goodbye to Ellie. And Russell will have to say goodbye to Carl.
That was good.
Ben? I was
Dark.
just gonna say, I don't know.
Mic drop.
Youth.
Damn, guys!
Little-
Like you two dork. Like I'm sorry, I made you. Did the therapist make you feel something by accident?
Wait, you guys still have emotions?
I was just gonna say, I don't know, because like little kids, like balloons. Oh.
But you can't deny, I mean, in terms of Pixar's entire filmography, and they've made a lot of movies now, I think that just the image of the house flying because of the balloons, so the floating house, it's the most striking and memorable image they've ever crafted as a company, I think. In terms of all of their films, just like the flying house, I think is just their most iconic thing that's ever been created by the Pixar team. Yeah, that or I think Nemo. Nemo
I
is.
mean, it's just a fish, though.
Yeah, but he's so iconic. I'm just talking like an image,
An image.
and the theme, and it represents so many things.
Yeah,
so
you're right.
I think the floating house is the pinnacle of like the iconography of all Pixar films.
Yeah, I think that Pixar was just operating on just a different level back then, because this is 2009, and this is when Disney bought Pixar. And I wouldn't say like their quality of animation's gone down, but a bit of the storytelling has changed over the last 5 to 10 years. And I feel like we're not getting dense, highly thematic stories and characters like we were getting with movies like Up and Ratatouille and Toy Story, Monsters Inc. and
I think
Coco.
The last great one was Coco.
I think Coco was
2019.
terrific,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I'll give that one as kind of an
And
outlier.
Soul was good.
Soul's really great too, but I mean, Luca didn't really have it. It was fine, and the most recent ones were fine. But I think Up is like the pinnacle of what Pixar can achieve as a production company and studio.
Well, yeah, it influenced all the other movies they made. I mean, Toy Story took a much more mature themes on the next two films after Up. And so I think Up changed the trajectory of what they realized they could do as storytellers in that plane of making children's films.
Well, yeah, and if you look at just the themes in Toy Story 3 alone, like the amount of like tear-jerky storytelling that happens in that, and yet again, it's the same themes of having to let go and move on and let things transform and find new meaning, which is therapy.
All right, what else are we going to talk about? What I love about this movie is this is coming off Ratatouille in 2007.
2007.
And Ratatouille really changed the game when it came to filmmaking for their animation style and really kind of incorporating production elements, cinematography, making digital lenses, digital cameras to kind of give it that, like you're actually on a set shooting a film with lenses, with setting up shots and dolly zooms. And, you know, at times when I watch Up, I sometimes feel like they're trying to do their best Steven Spielberg impression with a lot of the cinematography and a lot of the sequences, especially the first act of the film. But I think that's why this one's also so special, is they started really developing those techniques. And I mean, they mastered it with Toy Story 4 for sure.
Yeah, it's beautiful. But I also think that definitely the first time I saw it, and watching it again, I think I've only seen it twice, but I've definitely would relate to Carl more than any other character, because I've had instances in my life where I've just been in that rut, and I've isolated, and I've pushed people away, and I've kind of had a nihilistic view of things, and not wanted to open up to other people, and that's something I've struggled with in the past, when I was in my 20s, off and on a few times. And I was in very dark places and alone, and never felt lonelier in my life. And so I think the character of Carl and how they portray those ideas and those things that so many people can suffer through in their lives, it's really well done. And for me, I found it to be extremely relatable, because I think, I mean, everybody goes through their rough spots and the rough patches in life, and it's hard to get out of it, and it's impossible to get out of things like that on your own, which ultimately I think is one of the main messages of the film, is to not isolate yourself like Carl does, because he found that it did nothing for him, and then embracing life is really the only thing that worked to pull him out of that.
And before we continue, the best way to support Raiders of the Lost Podcast is to leave those 5-star reviews on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, aka iTunes. I love to read the Apple reviews, which let you leave written 5-star reviews, so I'll read one off in a couple of minutes. I can't wait to get to that. But this helps us get seen by new people. It helps us promote our show on the platforms all over the internet, so new people can discover Raiders of the Lost Podcast. You can also become a patron at patreon.com/Raiders of the Lost Podcast. We have 5 different tiers of support and membership for Patreon. They are as low as $2, gets you access to every single bonus episode, as well as the weekly chat, which posts every Wednesday on Patreon. $2, $5, $10, $25, and $100. Every tier has different levels of perks, like video messages. $10 gets you access to our Discord community, where we have watch parties and interact with you all the time. $25 is a great perk. You get a custom episode wherever you want. We'll do it for you. $100 is full of incredible things like free merch, a private watch party, come on the show after 3 months for a fun guest segment. So Patreon allows us to do this show full time. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you so much to our patrons all around the world. This episode is sponsored by our friends at movieposters.com. Use our promo code at movieposters.com to get 10% off your order today. They are also doing a movie poster giveaway in this episode. If you want to enter for a chance to win a free movie poster, all you have to do is leave us a 5-star Apple review, screenshot it, and then DM it to us on Instagram. Now, if you've already left us a review, all you have to do is hit leave a review, and it'll actually show your previous review. You can screenshot that and send it to us, so you don't have to delete that and make another one. And if you don't have an Apple account, all you gotta do is use an email to sign up. It's super easy. So again, leave us a 5-star Apple review and send it to us on Instagram DMs. We will select a winner next week. Good luck, everyone. In the meantime, be sure to go to movieposters.com for all of your poster needs and use our promo code Raiders10 to get 10% off your order.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's going to make it more connectable to the audience to recognize that there's something about these stories, these films, that connect to the real experiences we've all had, and that we're seeing it told in another avenue that allows us to connect to our own experience without it being as on the nose as our own life was. And it's not as painful, but you can still relate and find healing. And like we talked about in our last experience, sometimes even watching a film can help us find a narrative pathway to a corrective experience that can heal a wound. And it's so important. And I think you're dead on. This movie almost to a T follows the work of Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist who was imprisoned in Auschwitz and lost his wife to extermination. And his entire work, his therapy, logotherapy, and the idea that he comes up with both taps into Nietzsche and nihilism, and where Nietzsche himself ended up with was a famous quote that often gets falsely attributed to Frankl, including by me before, which is that a man who has a why can endure any how. The pioneer of the question of nihilism is the one who came up with that question. And then Frankl takes that and extrapolates into the most important point I think that's ever been made in existential psychology, which is that suffering is unavoidable. We cannot escape pain. We cannot escape death. We cannot escape any degree of suffering. So what we can do about it is to make meaning from our suffering. And we see that in this story where Carl takes his suffering, and instead of staying deep and isolated in it, like we have all had periods of time in our life that we have done, and chooses to let this little kid in who's a complete representation of his past self and rediscover it and make meaning out of his life now by being someone who can be important and there for Russell. And that is where he finds his freedom and can let go of the thing that means more to him than anything else, which is that grape soda button top or a bottle cap that Ellie pinned onto him when he was 8 years old.
Yeah, and I think along with the meaning part is shifting roles too, because Carl is so identifies with being like Ellie's partner. And I think that's what he's still, that's the well he's still dipping into to try to help himself feel better. So I would argue that I wonder if he probably can acknowledge that he is isolated. And I bet you, because he's still talking to her, like through the house and through the house later on, if there's a part of him that is telling him, well, I'm still with her. And because I'm still in this home that I refuse to leave, and I'm still talking to her, and the house is still I'm still surrounded by her. And we see in the third act that he throws everything, very symbolic. He throws everything that was the two of them, including the chairs that they focus in on, out of the house to save Russell. And I think in that moment, he is allowing his role to shift from Ellie's partner and the Carl he was before to the Carl he can now be to Russell, and being like an adult protector and support for Russell and letting himself evolve and grow. I mean, it happens in a dire moment. So his brain doesn't have to be, his brain's moving quick. So he just kind of makes that choice, right? He doesn't have to toil about it really. And I think that's a big part of that meaningful work, like you're referencing, Ben, is, also how can we shift the role we have in our community, the role we have with others, and that I think we all kind of acknowledge, especially coming off of like pandemic and like significant times of lockdown, that community is really important, and that being with others and having a support system is important. One of my first notes in watching this is like, where's Carl's support system? Like, once Ellie's gone, why is that it? He's older, but he's not like 90 where everyone he knows would no longer be around. Why doesn't he have community? And like, I mean, his neighbors, I guess, are gone. Ugh, but even just,
Yeah, girl.
were they both only children? It makes me really curious of like, how did he get to this place of isolation? And that we do it because we want to protect ourselves. Like something you guys brought up, I think before we started recording, is vulnerability. Like the anecdote to this isolation is allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, to like go out in the world and allow yourself to be potentially hurt again. I mean, a lot of why we isolate is very protective in nature, on top of just it feeling sometimes insufferable, the idea of trying to change or trying to do something different in our lives to bring about change. Because we have to, when I talk about vulnerability with clients, a lot of times they look like they want to barf, which I get. But it's kind of like everything you want in a lot of ways is on the other side of vulnerability and discomfort.
Well, and it makes me think a lot about how, one of the things that anxiety and depression do really well is make it feel like you're alone. It's a big part of how they work together, of really making it seem as though you're completely alone, and as if no one would understand, and as if no one else has ever felt this way before, and really makes it feel very singular. And I would wonder too, and be curious about Carl in general. I think that there's some natural isolation that happens with our elderly community in general, because I think if they don't have a big family, if their kids are spread out, if they don't have any children, I think that there is a lot of ways that we don't interact with people over a certain age in our community, because it's not something we don't really honor the elderly in our culture.
In this culture.
In this culture that we have, we don't really honor them. And so there really isn't a lot of ways for them to naturally be supported unless they already have a group of people around them where they've stayed in the same place for a long time. But even with Carl in this situation, even the people that he knew around who lived around him, maybe that was his only community. Everybody sold their place, or maybe they had left previously. So I think one of the things, I think Carl's experiencing some natural experiences of isolations, as well as isolating himself from not being with the person who he shared his entire life with. I mean, he knew her since he was 8 in a lot of ways. And I've heard this said before, just like, I don't know, online somewhere, or this is how people talk about it in general, is that men often are married to their best friend. And so their motivation to find an entire community is not often as likely as it is for women to want to have a community, continue to build their community. It's not the same. Men aren't really given the same choice. And again, not that all men don't have their own communities, because they certainly do, but more that it's not as supported in our culture that for men to be happy. That's one way that a man could be happy, is by having a community of people around him. And so a part of this, I think too, is just showing that as you get older, I think sometimes some of those relationships and experiences are just harder to come by. And I think, and also knowing that when we lose someone, the way that we see the world changes a lot. And the way that we experience grief also feels very singular.
That's great. Time. That's a great point, because it can relate to the cause of his depression. Because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of depression is a hyper focus on the past, and kind of an obsession over the past events, whether positive or negative, and that can fuel the depression, and why he's so consumed by his past, by his history, because she's not there anymore. So he's focused on how good his life used to be. And so he's not paying attention to the present or the future. And so he's just lost himself into the memories of the past that was good. and so he's not embracing what can be anymore.
I mean, there is the saying that depression lives in the past and anxiety lives in the future. So that could be a bit of what you're talking about. And I think there can just be a lot of not living in the present. I think most mental health diagnoses, symptoms, a common feature of them is you're not living in the now. Your brain is somewhere else. That's why a lot of mindfulness practice is what is recommended as practical coping skills for depression, anxiety, to bring you back into the now, like what's currently happening. Because also depression, you can't do anything about what's already changed. It's a really good way to stay stuck and to beat yourself up and to marinate on the things that aren't going well. Or maybe another way you're suggesting to romanticize the past sometimes as well, or to get really stuck on it. Like if this had gone different, or if I had done that, kind of what you mentioned earlier, Ben, which we talk about in our Spider-Man episode, our most recent one, is like that corrective experience idea. Like maybe if I could go back and if I just had, not torn my ACL and gotten into the NFL or whatever, that my life would be totally different and I wouldn't feel the way I am now. And it's really hard. Like a big component that I teach clients is radical acceptance, just the idea that we can't know that. And so to keep marinating on that what function is it serving if it's just to torment ourselves? Because sometimes it is helpful to look backwards if it helps us gain perspective on, or just information about, where did I used to find meaning? What used to help me feel good? A lot of times I work with clients, I talk about when they're kids. Maybe I would do this with Carl, like what made you feel good and like yourself when you were young, when before we got like kind of bogged down by life and social, acceptability. And could you bring some of that into your life now to help yourself feel, I don't know, like yourself, feel authentic, and getting yourself out of the isolation and the negative habits that can form with depression? Because a lot of depression too is just ruminating, being stuck. And then depression's so good at feeding itself. Then you don't take care of yourself as much as you would like to. You don't see other people. It just keeps you really locked in to your head. And you can get really stuck in the past because you're not really creating new good experiences, and or the future is not available to you. You either can't visualize it, you can't see it, you can't believe in it. So what is the future other than more of this?
And then, and to contrast that, in a way, anxiety is hyper focused on a negative outcome of a possibility of the future, and presenting it as a too real of a possibility, even though it's hasn't happened yet, but having too much of a focus on a negative outcome in the future.
That can be part of it. What's important to understand about anxiety is that anxiety is the overactivation of our alarm system that's designed to make us uncomfortable enough that we do something that promotes our survival. And why that's important is because we only have one body. We have one body, but our mind is capable of dissociating into infinite realities. So kind of like being uploaded into the Matrix, where you can imagine infinite worlds or be in the danger room for the X-Men. You have one body that is fighting imaginary villains, and you can get really tired and really worn out, but the machine that can run those simulations can never, ever stop, and it will be fine. So understanding that anxiety partially comes from overactivation of the nervous system, you can understand that part of the way for dealing with anxiety is calming the body back down and grounding to the present, because otherwise you can run infinite scenarios and ask yourself infinite of those what if questions that do have that negative outcome that then you hyperfixate on. But the key that gets missed in a lot of early therapy, even for like early career clinicians, is understanding that talking to somebody who's anxious to tell them, well, why don't you just be calm or calm down, or why don't you just stop it? Like the old Bob Newhart skit, stop it.
Not think about that. Why don't you just not think about that?
Well, that doesn't even make sense. Why would you worry about that? That's not even going to happen.
Doesn't work, and just promotes shame that internalizes the messaging that there's no way out, and then builds into depression. But what is important to understand is that it's, yes, the fixation on those things, but it's also the activation that comes with it. And the only way out of it is to solve the activation first, ground back to the present. And the question I love to ask people with that of, is there a tiger trying to eat you right now in this room? And they go, no. Like, then do you need your body to be that tense right now, or your heart to be going, no? Okay, so nothing. So we've established nothing is trying to eat you from like alive right now, right? No? Okay, breathe. It's okay to breathe. And you can see the level drop, and then the thoughts speed up. And one of my favorite stories to tell, this little anecdote, is think about all the ridiculous shit you will do when you are running late and you lose your keys. Yeah, there it is. You felt that, right?
Yeah. Absolute panic.
Right? Like tearing couch cushions up and emptying the garbage
Yeah.
can, and like checking behind the milk because one time your friend left the keys there and you want to be sure you didn't too. And like making sure you check like in between your car seats until you realize what happened was a piece of mail fell on top of where your keys always go. But because you were distressed and running late, your body was already so activated that you couldn't even perceive to think, move the paper. All you looked and saw, because you were stressed and in reactive mode, was no keys, which prompted you to elevate further into anxiety of, what if I get fired? What if this happens? What if I can't pay my rent? What if, and then those points you were making come true. But think about, even when I said, lose your keys running late, you guys had physical reactions to it.
Visceral reaction.
Oh man, why you gotta be like that?
And so in that regard, so in terms of Carl and his depression, not being in the present, so to contrast the effects of anxiety, he is not moving, he's stagnant, he's an inactive person, and he's become a passive person in the world. And these all stem from his depression. And so I would wonder, if Carl walked into your office to seek treatment, what would the steps be for you to treat him?
So I'm going to tell you that I am going to try not to go too deep, but I would differentiate between hypoarousal from trauma and grief and depression.
Yeah.
Chronic hypoarousal is a really important thing to understand, and that if you try to just treat Carl for depression, which I personally view depression more as when people have that chemical imbalance that prevents them from producing enough of the neurotransmitters they need to get the natural rewards for doing things normally. Like when you were saying, like you had a period where you're feeling like lonely and depressed and down, did working out or anything that you would normally do provide the same buzz, same boost that it
Absolutely
usually did?
not.
None.
Absolutely not.
Right?
Yeah.
Like no matter what you did, it wouldn't feel good. Like your brain
Exactly.
was not producing enough chemicals to give you the natural reinforcement that comes with doing it. And I think when I look at depression, I usually view it more as getting stuck in that, where you have like depleted your well and you can't get out. But the question we need to ask is, what happened that caused that? Because sometimes there's no reason. Sometimes we're just there. But other times there's grief and trauma that's unprocessed and gets stuck. So for Carl, I would want to process with him the trauma of losing Ellie, of watching her get old, watching her get sick, and then seeing her die. I think I would want to start there, because I think where Carl is at is that every minute he's alive, he has to face the reality that she's not there. So he's kind of partially dissociated. Our dissociative defense system works on two levels. I can win, and it is where our fight and flight live, right? If I can win by doing something. So I can either run away or I can fight this to beat it. There is no running away from death, and there's no fighting it. So we choose the other side, which is freeze and fawn. Now, Carl's not fully frozen, but he's shut down. Like you're saying, he's withdrawn. He's not engaging. He's staying stuck in a reality that's pleasing to him, so much to the point that he strikes somebody in the head with his cane who's grappling with the only physical representation of Ellie that he really has left besides the house, which is that mailbox.
Yeah, that's a trauma response right there. Like whenever you have a reaction that doesn't match the situation.
Right.
And we don't as
Yeah.
a society understand trauma reactions enough. And we tend to really, which what happens to Carl in this movie, just vilify people
Mm-hmm.
when
Mhm.
they have those over the top reactions. Like that'd be a situation which you'd call someone crazy in like a not so nice way.
Or incompetent or senile. And
Mm-hmm.
really, Carl is quite sharp. He is not senile at all. He does not need to be anywhere. He's not a public menace. Where he
Mm-hmm.
is he's so stuck in this I can't win. So he's finding his freeze out point.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, coming from a trauma-focused narrative or trauma-focused orientation, I am going to want to process with Carl the things that he believes he can't escape from, so that his only way out of pain is to shut down, because otherwise it's too painful and he can't do it. That's
Mm-hmm.
where I would start.
Yeah. And I would just want to say as well, like Carl wouldn't be in Hannah or Ben, you can disagree with me, but Carl would be someone I would even diagnose with depression. I'd probably diagnose him with adjustment disorder, which is how it sounds, which is you're having difficulty adjusting to a big change in life, which can be bereavement. And that's when someone like Carl walks into your office, you need to make sure you ask their whole story. Because if you just ask, what are your current symptoms? Like you would maybe diagnose someone like him with depression, and that wouldn't be correct. Unless these symptoms that he's showing now were things that have come up before in other moments of his life, even when he was with Ellie or, at different stages of his life. But if it's just something that like depression or anxiety symptoms that have only come on after a significant life change, then we would give them an adjustment diagnosis, not like a mood disorder or even like generalized anxiety disorder, unless the anxiety started popping up everywhere about everything. And even then I would take my time before I would switch someone over from adjustment to generalized. But you can have both too.
And adjustment disorder comes with specifiers for with
Yeah.
depression, with anxiety, with mixed, with disturbance of conduct, with all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
It's a diagnosis that can be applied for 30 days or so long as the effects of the change are active in their life, which is where it gets really difficult to provide a correct diagnosis for someone who's grieving, because death is permanent.
Yeah, it's not like a situation's going to go away anytime soon, which is why like
It's not
that
like a
30-day
breakup.
thing. Oh, I would
Yeah.
say it's more
Breakup is grief.
Yeah. Like an active ongoing situation, which I would argue is most things people have to adjust to, like are active ongoing situations. Adjustment's a slippery diagnosis, mostly with insurance companies. They're the ones that don't want you to have it hung on for too long.
Mhm.
Hannah, you look like you have an
Exactly.
opinion.
Well, you know how I feel about insurance companies, which is what I was thinking of. No, but I was thinking about how, definitely what Ben said in terms of treatment. But I think also the important thing with Carl will be helping him figure out his identity again. When we have a big major loss like this, when we lose the person that again gives us so much meaning, we have so many roles attached to being their partner, being their friend, being a part of their family, that how Carl identifies himself for the rest of his life will be different than it was before Ellie died. And helping him create that identity, feel comfortable with identity, even just thinking about what he means and what that means to him now, what it means to be a widower, helping him identify that and find that identity for him that feels the most comfortable for him going forward. I think that would be one of the big things that I would focus on with him. And of course, along with all the things that Ben said too, like all of those things are really important as well. But I think also just really helping him understand that he's going to be different than he was before Ellie died. And that's just the truth. That's what happens when we have a major loss in our life, a major loss, to lose a spouse that you've been with for more than half of your life. It's going to change who you are.
I mean, I can't even imagine for him, because if they met at like 8, I would imagine like he's never really existed in a time that he remembers without her. Like that would feel as a therapist, I would feel overwhelmed on my client's behalf about that. Like I'd be
Yeah.
like, oof, we aren't going to be on a journey together, you and I, because that's hardcore. You know, not just to have lost the spouse you met when you were in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, but when you were little and that's been your best friend. That's really tough.
I
And then on top
agree.
of that, his life has been defined by her
Mhm.
in their relationship, not having children, not having, like you said, a support system of other people around them. So once she's gone, what does he have?
Yeah, as
Yeah.
therapists, is it dangerous to be that dependent on somebody else and vice versa in a relationship? And like you said, not having a support system, is there a danger to that psychologically?
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, I do couples
Yeah.
therapy every now and again. And Hannah's also a couples therapist, so she can chime in if I'm getting anything wrong. But I have this conversation with couples where I'm like, you're not supposed to be each other's everything. That's also a toxic sort of like Disney narrative that your partner is like your best friend and your lover and your confidant and everything. And that's not fair. Like, it's a lot of pressure to put on one person, for starters. And then two, we're supposed to have a support system. We're supposed to diversify where we get our needs met, because you know, your partner might have, no offense to them, like they're not super strong maybe in one area, and that's where you go to another person in your life. Even for silly things like if your boyfriend doesn't like to watch movies, so you have a friend that you go to the movies with, because if that's a passion of yours. And then there are certain things that, you know, when I work with couples, sometimes they have sensitive topics that are triggers for them, and that'll become a hard topic between them of like, well, I should be able to talk to you about anything. And so I sometimes have to tell couples, you know, it's okay if you can't talk. That's why we have friends. That's why we have close friends. We have family, because there are some topics that your partners are allowed to have boundaries around for their own well-being. And so, yeah, it's not healthy. And also from the, like this movie brings up, is if God forbid something happens to your partner or your best friend or whoever, what then? You never want anything that makes your well-being stable to be one thing. Whether it's, I mean, I talk to this to teenagers about their phones. Like, I'm like, what if your phone falls down a gutter and dies? Are you going to be screwed? Like, you never want just one person, one object, one activity to be the end all be all for yourself, because life is out of our control in a lot of ways. And you don't want to be at the whims of that one thing. So yeah, I mean, and also it can create a lot of incidental codependence and enmeshment, where it makes me curious how much of that might have been going on with Carl and Ellie, just organically. Not that I think that they're like toxically codependent. And also it makes me curious because Ellie is shown when they were growing up as seeming to be the more outgoing one of the two. So I'm also curious if maybe Ellie was the person that brought in other relationships into their partnership. And once she died, I'm curious if there was community that petered out because Carl didn't know how or couldn't or chose not to or maintain it. So, I mean, there's still a lot we don't know about what their life looked like outside of their specific relationship before she died. And maybe he did ostracize the people that were around and became kind of a classic curmudgeon, which is kind of how the movie opens, you know, like really, which is a way to have control, right? When you feel like something has happened to you that's really out of control, we can always control destroying something. So when we get into more self-sabotagey behaviors, it can be a way to also feel like we're protecting ourselves, and depression loves that. They're like, oh, you're going to keep doing stuff that confirms that you're a piece of garbage. Well, we already feel like you're a piece of garbage. So this is great for us. So yeah, like, why don't you yell at that guy, or why don't you throw your mailbox at that dude? And then we can just lay in the confirmation bias euphoria that you are a piece of garbage that no one likes anymore. And the only person who liked you died. So now what? You know, all that stuff. It's like, I try to tell clients, there is like it is satisfying especially when we're depressed or going through depression symptoms, there is satisfaction to being confirmed in those beliefs that are really negative. Like, why does it feel hard to take a compliment? And why is it sometimes feel so satisfying to screw something up? I mean, it's all that simple fact that our brain loves sameness and our brain hates difference because it's uncomfortable. And so, yeah, it's a very long answer to your question, but
No, it was a great answer.
Fascinating, honestly. And I look at the finale when Carl is ridding the house of all the items to lighten it and save Russell. I look at that he's of him finally saying goodbye to Ellie, and finally accepting her passing, accepting what happened, and being able to move on. But essentially,
Exactly.
him clearing the house of items is his. He's finally saying goodbye to her.
yeah, it's like a little like rich, like it doesn't quite happen like this in the movie because it's done under duress. But I
Yeah.
do think before that, though, he does have that sort of more ritualistic grieving moment where he lets himself finally sit down and look through her adventure book. And that's something that really true to grieving process. And sometimes I talk about with clients is, do you need to find time to be with, in essence, the person that you lost, and to maybe watch something or do something or read something that you shared together or that reminds you of them, to really, well, one, say goodbye, right? That's kind of the typical response, but also to let yourself feel your feelings. You know, that's a hot topic right now on TikTok, somatic therapy, feeling your feelings. But it is like letting yourself really have those feelings in and not fighting them anymore. So I wonder if part of him being able to do that is he finally let himself have that breathing moment right before, of like just radically like acknowledging that she's gone.
He did. He had to.
Mhm.
And Brittany, there was something that I wanted to point out in your metaphor before,
Yeah.
that you were talking about essentially like how important it is, and you guys asked if is it dangerous, right? You guys called me a dork, and then you proved my exact point
What?
in your very long answer,
What?
that the whole movie uses a balloon as a metaphor for the fragility of the
Okay.
relationship and how dangerous it is to base your happiness on that. But that I will give you the pass because you probably have not had a child who had their birthday balloon blown away in the wind on their birthday.
I'll give you a little anecdote. One of my first anxiety freakouts as a child, it was like 4, and I had to have a balloon for a dance recital performance, and my brothers popped it. Ugh, villain origin story. And I cried hysterically with anxiety about showing up to this dance recital without my balloon. So, you know, we're all having great memories about balloons in this room today.
And now we know why you guys responded to me with a hostile response. You see, there it is.
Well, I thought your silly ass was going to bring up Batman somehow.
I also thought you were going to bring up Batman. I was waiting for you to be a dick. So, yeah.
You know what the
Still,
best
there's
part
still
of this
time.
is?
There's still time.
There's still time, but I didn't even have to be the first one to say Batman. So I don't know if you guys know, but in every single episode, I essentially play the Kevin Bacon game with them with Batman. And I find some super obnoxious way since the beginning of our show to tie every episode to Batman some way, somehow, and they never know when I'm going to do it or how I'm going to do it.
I can feel it sometimes.
I
like in the
always know when
wind-
you're going to
in the
do it.
wind.
Don't
I
act
can
like
feel
we
it.
don't know. You get this stupid look on your face. I always know when you're about
He
to
puts
talk
on the
about
cowl.
Batman.
Yeah, he's got a cowl.
Exactly.
Is it this
Yes,
look?
exactly.
For everyone
starts
listening
talking
with
like
a visual
this.
medium attached, Ben just made himself a mask with his fingers. You're the coolest guy I know, Ben.
I am not.
I could connect this movie to Santa Claus though. So the actor who plays Carl played Santa in Elf.
That's
Oh,
true.
way.
Yes, he did. Ed Asner is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
What a fun
Yes,
fact.
sir.
So if someone's dealing with this adjustment disorder, whether it's from, you know, a loss of a loved one or a hard breakup, how does someone move on and let go of that grief and try to accept new people into their lives and accept maybe a new relationship without being in the state of isolation and having this massive wall built up?
I think it comes primarily through the acceptance and acknowledgement that feelings exist to communicate meaning from our experiences. And without them, we can't feel what we need to move what had been true from an is and a predictably will be so to a was, and deal with the pain that it takes to re-encode all those memories and all that information and all those predictive expected memories. Like, oh, on Christmas, I'll be unwrapping presents with Ellie and I'll get her this for Christmas. Or when you break up with somebody, oh, we're going to go on this trip, or we go to the wedding, or I'd normally do that with her. All that has to be felt as we re-encode it, because when you encoded the memory in the first place as a good thing in your brain of, oh, being with this person makes me happy, all of those memories now have to get re-encoded with loss. And people avoid the hell out of that because it's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not until we can accept that and deal with those feelings that we can close that chapter and move on. Like, you have to be done with something before you're ready to go on.
Yeah.
And I feel like that definitely affect finding a new relationship, because obviously in this film, Carl, there's nothing about him finding a new love or dating. But I know they came out with a little short film about him going on a date. So what challenges is Carl going to face in terms of maybe pursuing another partnership or to try and find a new companion in his life? Because all those memories he made with Ellie were in a relationship, and so would he suffer those consequences of trying to pursue dating it would cause him pain to be around another woman, to start dating another woman, or to try and put himself in these situations that he spent 70 years with Ellie as a couple, as a partner, so would trying to become a partner with someone else cause him pain as well?
It certainly would cause him pain. Yes.
Yeah.
It
I mean,
absolutely would cause him pain. And at that stage in life, it usually takes, this is something we went over in some of our marriage and family classes, and Hannah can probably talk to it better, but even in our marriage and family and lifespan classes, is that as people age and you start looking for partners in different phases of your life, you have to remember that by the time you're 78 years old, or, by the time you're in your 30s or 40s, the dating pool of single people that have no kids or people that haven't had a life before you is almost none. And you have to create space for that to be real and that to be okay to have a successful partnership. Hannah, I don't know if you want to build on that. Take that as a yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead, Brittany.
Hannah.
Go ahead. No,
I
you
was
go
just
ahead.
gonna say, I think what'll be hard. I mean, I guess my hope would be that his dating pool is around his age, Carl's, and I haven't seen this short, but that I can't imagine anyone he wouldn't be dating wouldn't have some sort of similar life experience. If you're single at that age, my assumption would be statistically that most of those people would be widows or widowers. And so I can't imagine there wouldn't be a lot of empathy and understanding around that. And I would imagine a part of dating in that pool of dating is, what are our boundaries around talking about our maybe dead loved ones? Like, do we give room in our relationship for discussing who we've lost, our like husbands and wives that have passed? What does that look like? Maybe it's comforting for them both to have permission to discuss as much as they want or need to about who they had before. Maybe there are some relationships at that age where they have a line to that. Like, once we've kind of gotten serious, can we not bring up Ellie all the time? And so I don't know, it'd be interesting to work with him and figure out like what he's looking for, and then how ready he feels, which I think sometimes you don't know how ready you're going to feel till you're doing it. So sometimes when I do like that kind of adjustment work with people after a big change, is one, do they feel not necessarily ready to jump back into the situation that came from before, like if it's dating, but if they feel ready to dip their toe in and be curious about how that will feel. So I try to remind people that it's not like an on and off switch. Like, you have to be like fully healed and like fully ready to like jump back in full force, which is why I think we can stay stuck. Is there this idea that either we're fully into dating again or whatever, or we're fully out? And then it's more just, can we think of ourselves kind of like an experiment where we try some things out, we have a hypothesis about what we can and can't handle, we dip our toe in, we learn from that information. I tell people sometimes it's like data gathering, and then in our sessions you bring the data in, and then we kind of just talk through how that felt. Did it feel too soon? Did it feel awful? Did it feel fun, actually better than you expected? And then all that stuff in terms of, I don't know, like dating at that age, it would be interesting to kind of figure that out with Carl. And I think that would be something too, where I took a gerontology class, so that was like a million years ago in grad school, in terms of what it is like to be that age and to be still like, I mean, like a sexual, vivacious, romantic person. You know, it's a different experience than when you're younger, but some ways it's not.
Yeah, I think the most important part would really be, what is Carl looking for and what is he hoping for? Because to be looking for a partner, I mean, he wasn't looking for a partner when he was 8 either.
He's never dated before.
Yeah. So really, it would really be more about like, what is he interested in now and what is his hope for now? Because I think when we think about people who are dating in this generation, I think it's a lot more about companionship and a lot more about finding somebody who has some similarities in terms of their experiences and having somebody to share and do things with. And so I feel like really making sure that it's something that he has an awareness about what he's looking for, I think would be helpful. And then just like Brittany said, trying some stuff out, seeing what sticks, seeing what doesn't.
And you're going to be uncomfortable. A big part of what I talk to clients about is you have
Absolutely.
to practice sitting in discomfort. It's not this thing where like it won't feel uncomfortable anymore and then you'll be ready to do it. It's more that, no, you have to be okay being a little bit uncomfortable, and like a safe amount of uncomfortable. And my job can be to help figure out what that line is. And that can be like, you're going to try something that feels possible, doesn't feel too scary or too unsafe or too whatever. And then we'll see where that falls in terms of your window of tolerance. And then also, ideally, we teach, like Ben referenced a while back, that your body can be quite activated during these experiences. So I also always want to make sure that when I'm asking clients to take chances, because that's what I'm doing, that they have a toolbox of coping skills, like practical ones, like CBT skills, grounding techniques, mindfulness techniques that they can draw on and feel empowered by and feel confident in, that they can rely on when they will become anxious. I tell clients, it's not like you probably will. You will be anxious. You may have this experience. It's not going to be like all roses. And you have skills. And I hope that you can trust me, your therapist, that I think you can handle it. Even if it goes badly, you can handle that. You know, it's a lot of
not to run away from discomfort.
Yeah, which we love to do. And anxiety is always like, if you feel uncomfortable, that means it's bad. So go away and avoid it, please, and thank you.
Well, that's what Western society teaches us.
That's true.
Eastern society teaches us something much different, and I think it's really important to recognize that someone like Carl would have been taught your feelings. Nobody cares about those.
I mean, like that Charles guy that he idolizes, he's basically been hiding in the friggin' nowhere forever because he doesn't deal with his feelings. He's made a bunch of dog robots.
Well, yeah, and like
because
looking
of his
at
ego.
well, looking at this movie, we get one piece of information that tells us when this takes place, and that is that
GPS.
No, well, actually, that's an interesting point. Maybe we don't.
GPS.
Well, no, because never mind, because he did have GPS, so that's interesting. Because I was like, oh, maybe this movie is set a little further back because the cars are always old, and then they go to see Star Wars together.
That's true, but like the businessman in the beginning, he's talking on a cell phone.
That's true. Yeah.
So,
yeah, there's some tech in there.
So I'm assuming it is present day of the movie.
Yeah, I always assumed it was present, like contemporary when it was made, I guess.
Yeah.
I actually can connect it to Batman.
Oh,
I can. Are you ready?
Yeah, you want to say it together?
Let's do it together, guys.
2, 3. Composer.
Michael Giacchino.
Yes.
Yes.
High five.
Michael Giacchino. He just did the Batman score.
He absolutely did, and the Batman score was fantastic. And wait, we can connect this one more time on another level that I can be super, super thrilling about. The same composer is also the first person not named John Williams to do a Star Wars movie.
Oh,
correct.
Right.
Yeah.
He did Rogue One.
Oh,
he did.
Which is the
He's
best
awesome.
of the new Star Wars movies. Fight me.
That's usually like the Rogue One hive. They're that determined.
Very determined. No, there were good ones also, but Rogue One was the best.
He's a wonderful composer. He's one of my favorites. And when I like to say who the contemporary John Williams is, I think Michael Giacchino is the guy. They have such similarities in how they write, and their tendencies and their use of classical instrumentation. Giacchino doesn't use electronics very, very rarely. Most of the time, he just sticks to the traditional orchestra, which is what John Williams has always done. So, plus the complexity of his writings, it's very reminiscent of how John Williams composes music.
And also the simplicity of an incredible theme for a character or for a movie. I mean, John Williams has made so many, even Harry Potter, even obviously Star Wars. But
Jaws is very simple.
Jaws is very simple as well, but something simple that everyone can think of and connect to with this movie. They're both geniuses.
And perhaps Indiana Jones, guys? Come on.
Of course.
I mean,
the
of course.
namesake. I mean, we could go through the whole filmography of them both if you want.
There's Jaws right there, too.
I see. You got both of them. But yeah, and even like the whimsicalness of his voice. When we went to see Indiana Jones last week, and I realized it comes up for me when I hear it, but I didn't realize how similar Leia's theme and Marion's were.
Oh, it's basically the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, very similar.
And then if you watch, you could watch Home Alone to like Sorcerer's Stone music. It's like you could watch the same movies, vice versa.
And you can hear that same Leia Marion theme in E.T. here and there as well.
Yeah. He's written a lot of music. Sometimes
There's only so many notes.
Yeah,
I mean, if you're hiring John
so much
Williams, it's because you're wanting that John Williams stank on it.
Exactly.
And that is that stank, and I love it every time.
Hans Zimmer made Time like 4 times with all different movies, and I don't care.
I ate
it's
it
great.
up.
Pirates and Gladiators, same thing.
Yeah.
Gladiator is Hans. What's his name? Hans Zimmer.
Hans Zimmer.
Yeah.
So he pirates this theme, and then Gladiator, like the
Yeah.
same kind of brass percussion.
Oh, yeah, it's basically the same song. Yeah.
Yeah, I want that, that Doom score just screaming into my ears. I love it.
I cannot wait for Dune.
Dune was so good.
I know. Cannot wait for the sequel. Do you have anything more you want to talk about from a therapist standpoint, you three?
No, other than I think this movie speaks a lot to how powerful it can be for different generations to connect. I can't remember the country this was in, but there was I think it was like a YouTube sort of like docu-series thing I watched, just like an episode of a merging of a daycare kindergarten facility and a like elderly home, and how for mental health, how good it was for the residents of the elder facility to have these little kids around them because little kids basically had preschool amongst them. So when they were doing crafts, when they were having their like snacks and lunch, all this stuff they were doing together, they would read stories together. The kids would sit on their laps and like read books, and how revitalizing it was for the older generation to be like feel love and feel mastery. I think that's what's also beautiful as well. And I think other cultures who do more respect their elderly and bring them into society, there is so much that can be gained from that, of just the passed down, not just wisdom necessarily, but just having a place where you as an older person can demonstrate mastery to someone younger and feel worthwhile in that way, and feel just worthful. And also I think for the younger kids, these little kids, it just helps humanize older people. I think that we do a lot of, like we talked about Home Alone earlier, we do a lot of disservice of them being these like scary oogie boogie like people that are like around us, and we kind of try not to like be outwardly disdainful in our expression to little kids. We kind of just teach them to like watch their mouths, like watch their faces, and maybe go up there and give grandma a hug and don't look scared. But there's not this more organic connection. And I think in that, like that example that I watched that thing on, what was so beautiful is it just let organic interactions happen between them. They weren't like pressuring the little kids to mingle with the older adults. It was more just, we're all here together and we're all having a good time and we're all chilling out and learning and being, and letting those community connections form, instead of totally isolating those two communities from each other, and or forcing the connection, which is what we see more often, which is go give grandma a kiss, and don't look scared. So I think it just says a lot therapeutically about sort of like mentee-mentor relationships, having more chosen family, thinking more creatively about community, which I do think I'm hearing more and more of my clients talk about. And I'm thinking about too, as my own individual, about how are we finding organic community around us and trying harder to not be isolated, which is really easy to do nowadays with Zoom and our phones and stuff. It's easy to not realize how isolated you are, or that how far we have come from centralized community in even our neighborhoods. So that's more like my therapist / just person perspective on this movie.
All right, well, how about we wrap up this crossover between Popcorn Psychology and Raiders of the Lost podcast? Brittany, Hannah, Ben, thanks so much for joining us. This was a total blast. Raiders
great.
Listeners, definitely go check out Popcorn Psychology. And Popcorn Psychology, we would love for you to come check out our show, Raiders of the Lost podcast, as well. Do y'all want to say anything, last words to the fans and listeners?
No, just that you can find us wherever that you get podcasts, and you can find us on all social media at Popcorn Psychology. Not Threads yet. Haven't really experimented with Threads yet. I've heard mixed reviews, so
It's okay. I'm already giving up on it.
that's what I've heard pretty much. And then if you could let our fan base kind of hear one more time where they can find you all.
Raiders of the Lost podcast on every single audio platform, as well as YouTube. We do video podcasting as well. TikTok, Instagram, Threads as well. Twitter, Raiders of the Lost podcast. Letterboxd, Raiders Lost Pod. We are everywhere. We're so easy to find. Raiders of the Lost podcast.com is the easiest place. We have everything there on the homepage. And thanks so much for checking us out if you do. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
This episode was executive produced by our chosen one patrons, Cody Moen, Andrew Hagan, Becca Keene, Benjamin Cook, Calvin Murphy Griggs, Nicholas Martin, Darian Singleton, Tyler McFly, Andrew Hagan. Our chosen one patrons are our biggest supporters. Thank you so much. Raiders of the Lost podcast is a mirror image production. Sound mixing done by Jacob Kossler. Opening music by Chase Jackson.